Alright guys, welcome back to another project. So this was a fairly interesting one. Over all of the projects that I've done, this is one of the ones that probably took the longest. And although it's a fairly simple project overall, the main thing is just that came in during the holidays. Now with my new job, I got very busy doing that. There's also the family commitments and that, so this project ended up taking a lot longer than I'd initially expected for, again, what is a fairly simple project overall. Speaking of which, the goal with this project was to really push my skills with the stained glass. Now, the stained glass, I've only used it on one project before, so this was definitely a little bit of a overextension, we'll call it that, and it'll make more sense as we go through the project here. But the original idea was to make a cabinet that would kind of double as a lamp in a room. So what I wanted to do was use stained glass on 3 sides of the cabinet and then wire the inside with LEDs and still have floating shelves and all this stuff. I had very grand plans for this project, and I'm glad to say that most of it worked out just fine, but there's only one part that I wasn't able to complete, and that is the LEDs. Now, it's not anything because the LEDs didn't work, it's actually just because I wasn't super happy with how the stained glass ended up coming out. With my skills on the stained glass still needing a little bit of extra work, I just found that it didn't look good enough to put extra light behind. But again, that'll make more sense as we go through the project here. So to start out, what we're doing is just building a simple post structure. So 4 post legs, all made from 1.5 thick stock, and these are what's going to be the main structure of the piece. Now this is again one of my favorite ways to build because it's just super reliable. And aside from the structural benefits, there also is a lot of visual interest that's added by using these post leg construction, because it creates a lot of depth between the thickness of the legs and all of your stretchers either being inset or flush, however you decide to do them. You're going to end up with all these different depths and thicknesses in the piece, which does make the thing overall a little bit more interesting. So going through and working on all of our stretchers now, this is quite an easy process because you're just milling a whole bunch of pieces to the same 3/4 inch thickness and varying them by their slight different lengths. Now, one of the things I've been finding very funny lately on a lot of these different projects is just how easy this part is, how natural it has become to me as a woodworker. Even though I've only been woodworking for a few years, just going through and making stretchers, cutting mortise and tenon joinery, all this kind of stuff, it's just become kind of second nature. I don't really have to think about it. So it's not that I'm not thinking. Obviously, there's lots of spinning blades of death around the shop, and you got to be very aware of what's happening. But it's more so a case of I just know what steps I need to take in order to get a nice fit on these. And again, the big thing here is using my block plane to really sneak up on that fit and just touch up those shoulder lines to just get that perfect fitting joint. And that's one of those things that's it's taken me a long time to learn how to very well balance the hand tools and the power tool part of the project. Because that's the thing for me, is that power tools are all about getting the pieces made, whereas hand tools are all about finishing and fine-tuning the pieces to get them to be exactly what I want them to be. Now, working more on the side structure, this is something that one of my buddies pointed out to me recently, is that I actually do things in a slightly different way than a lot of other woodworkers, and that is I tend to build out a full frame as my side structure rather than just tying my floating panels into the legs themselves. And I found it kind of interesting when he pointed this out because I've never really thought too much about it. I've always liked this style. I think I've seen it on like some old shaker style pieces, or I don't know where I saw it or where I came up with it. But it's one of those things that I found that is interesting the way that I do it, because it is just slightly different than kind of the typical way of building furniture. Now, one of the other things you're going to notice throughout this project is that I'm going to be using a lot of dowels. And I wanted to give this a shot because I kind of have looked down on dowels for the longest time. I just always thought that they're just kind of a beginner or, not a great form of joinery because they're just a little bit too simple. But the more that I kind of think about it, and at this point I was kind of forced into doing it because the 1/4 inch mortise chisel for my mortiser is broken at the moment. So I decided to give the dowels a shot, and I'm actually very impressed by how easy they are to work with. As long as you take the time to line up the jig nicely, you can really get some good steady results with those dowels. And this is one of those things that's kind of made me consider maybe getting a domino joiner at some point in the future. It's nothing set in stone, but it's one of those things that I'm a little bit more open to after kind of actually working with those dowels and seeing how much easier the project is when your form of joinery isn't based off of the size of the piece of wood, it's just based off of a reference surface, which is exactly the difference between traditional mortise and tenon and something like dowels or dominoes. Now, another slight change to the way that I had to think about this project is because I'm going to be introducing glass into this, you always want to make sure that those glass panels are replaceable because they're very easy to break. It's very possible that something's going to get damaged there. So you always want to put your glass into a rabbet. So I've never actually done this way of making these side panels before, and I have to say it worked out quite well. So I basically just made that side structure. I was able to put my rabbet in very easily, and even the bottom panel, although it's going to be wood, I'm still going to hold it in with a rabbet just because it makes the project easier overall. It's just simpler to do things the same way rather than trying to do two different types of joinery and methods and all that. So I go in and I cut the rabbet, and then I'm going back in with my router plane to just get it perfect, because one of the things I've found with my fairly cheap router table is that it doesn't give me a very good flat reference surface. So just going in with my router plane helps me get that rabbet to be the exact same depth all the way around. Then I can go in and add some edge profiles and just touch things up. Now you might be wondering why I waited till now to put the curve on the bottom of these pieces. It would have been easier to do it with just the single piece before I put it all in the structure, but the main reason I waited till now was because it's way easier to clamp up that whole side frame when it had that flat bottom on it compared to having this curve on it, and I really didn't want to risk damaging the curve if I had to clamp onto it or anything. So just doing it in this way made it work a little bit easier. I'm also adding chamfers to the outside edges, so that way we create a little bit of separation between this side structure and the post legs. That'll just help add more layers of depth, and because we're going to be staining this whole piece a very dark brown, it's all about increasing the amount of those shadow lines in that, those little areas of texture and detail to make the piece just a little bit more visually interesting. Then the final step for the structure here is going through and adding some curves and some details to our front and back stretchers. Now all the stretchers that are going to go on the back all have rabbets in them that'll hold our back slats, and then our front stretchers have these slight curves to them, which I get to go in and tune up with my number 113. And I say this all the time, if you ever get the opportunity to add a number 113 to your hand tool collection, definitely do it. They are one of the most unique and useful tools I have ever purchased. It's one of the few tools that I use all the time that I thought I really wouldn't use that much. Now for the glue ups, I'm using Titebond 3 mostly because it's just what I wanted to use at this point in time. You guys will notice throughout all my different projects and videos, I tend to jump around between hide glue, between Titebond, sometimes using pin mortise and tenon, sometimes not. It really just comes down to what I think works best for the project and kind of a split-second decision. Now that doesn't sound great, but it's just kind of the way that it works for me. With the door frame, this is where I was really intrigued by the idea of using dowels, because it just seemed like it was going to make the process a little bit too easy, if that makes sense. Because if I was to do this with mortise and tenon joinery, and I was going to try and cut a groove and all that kind of stuff, I'd have to do a haunched mortise and tenon, which is a little bit of extra work, but overall, it's not too bad, but it is just that little bit of extra work. Whereas using this method where I'm using dowels and a rabbet, I can really just quickly smash together my joinery, glue the thing up, put my rabbet in the back, and it just is super quick and easy. So again, it's little things like this that kind of made me question whether or not a domino joiner might be a tool that I want to add to my shop someday, because the reality here is that these dowels or a domino, anything like that, is basically just a modern version or a different version of a mortise and tenon joint. So it's still a very good, strong form of joinery. It's just a little bit on the easier side. Now, I'm not going to be selling my mortise or anytime soon. I still really like just kind of the feeling of making that form of joinery, the more traditional style of mortise and tenon. I find that more enjoyable to work with, but it is kind of an idea that I have floating around in my mind. If there's ever a project where I need to kind of speed things up, using dowels or dominoes might be maybe a different option, we'll call it that. But anyway, we're going through and following again the same process I use on all my doors, where I'm using this hinge spacer to just create a little bit of separation. And I also find that this helps me align my hinges a little bit easier on the door. Overall, it just helps me get a better fit on the door when I use the hinge spacer versus just not using it. Moving on to the floating shelves, this is actually one of the most complex parts of this project, but I did a horrible job of actually recording the video of it, and you won't actually see any of the complexity with it. because basically my idea for this project with the LED wiring is that I wanted on each of the floating shelves to have undermount lighting. That way I could have my nice solid wood shelves but still have light all throughout the cabinet. Now what made this a little bit more complex is because I wanted to have the shelves both floating and wired with LEDs, I had to kind of think about that variable height and limiting it. But the other part of this is I also had to figure out where to hide the LEDs in these shelves. So basically these shelves are a frame and panel construction. And so on that panel, on the underside, I just made sure to push that rabbet that I've got on there in wide enough so that I could then fit it into the groove as well as put these strips of LEDs on there. Now again, I didn't actually take any video showing the undersides of these pieces because at this point I was planning to do the LED wiring, which is when I would have shown that. But if you're interested in the sizing and the specifications and all that I use, the free plans for this project will be available up on my website as soon as this video goes live. Then the drawers are another part of the project where I find that I can really just kind of let myself go into autopilot mode because I tend to know exactly what I want to do with the drawers right from the beginning of the project. And so in this case, I did actually end up changing my plans a little bit, and even according to the plans that'll be on my website, these ones I decided to use box joints just because I wanted something that was a little bit faster and a little bit easier. So originally I'd planned to do dovetails, but just because I was already, at this point I was already behind on this project by quite a few weeks, I didn't want to do dovetails just because they would have taken a little bit longer. So box joints were a nice quick option. All it meant is that I just had to shrink my drawers by a little bit, like a 1/16 of an inch here or there. So again, not a big deal, but just a little bit of shrinkage there. But the main benefit of box joints for me, again, is that they're just fast and simple. All I have to do is set them up in my jig and cut those joints, and I can have a drawer box together in a matter of minutes. It's actually a very quick and easy process that I quite enjoy. So although it's, again, the dovetails I think might have looked a little bit more interesting and probably would have made a better video, but the box joints were quick and easy, so they won out in the end. For the slides on these drawers, I'm going to be going the traditional route and just using solid wood because I've actually become a huge fan of this lately because they just work so well and so smoothly compared to ball bearing drawer slides. The problem that I've run into with ball bearing drawer slides is they do tend to have a lot of slop to them, which kind of makes it a little bit annoying unless you go for the very expensive ones, or they end up jamming up or getting gunked up a little bit over time just through the accumulation of dust. I also kind of worry about the longevity of a lot of these slides just because, again, unless you go for the really expensive ones, they're not always built the best. Whereas just using a piece of solid hardwood inside of a groove is guaranteed to last a lifetime. And again, if that wood starts to wear out over time, all you have to do is just make a new piece and it just slides right in super easily. So this is one of those things that I started to fall into that more traditional route of using those wood slides just because I found, again, personally speaking, they do work quite a bit better. Then for those bottom side panels, we're keeping it, again, very easy here. So all these are is just a glue up of quarter sawn red oak pieces, and then we're going to go through and add in this raised shaker profile. The panel can then be fit up into that rabbet we cut earlier, and then the only thing that's going to be holding these panels into place is those drawer slides we just fit up. And this was kind of the simplest, most ingenious thing I thought of while working on the project, and it just made it that much easier. So on the home stretch here, we're going to start working on the tabletop. So this is a piece of red or white oak, I don't quite know what it is, that I've had around my shop for a long time. And I love it because it's just this big, wide, solid piece. But the reason it's been around my shop for so long is because it's very challenging to figure out how to work with it because it's too wide for most of my machinery. So it means that I either get to pull out the router and do slab flattening basically, or I get to go at it with hand tools, which is what I chose to do here. Purely because I wanted a chance to pull out my number 7 and just get some extra hand tool work in. I find it very enjoyable every once in a while to try and flatten these boards. Now, you will see me cheating here using my drum sander. Basically, the only reason I use the drum sander there is just to make sure that my two faces were parallel with each other, because that's one of those things that I'm still not great at with my hand tool work, is getting the two faces parallel. So I just use the drum sander to help get things a little bit better aligned, and then I finish it off with the hand tools. From there, we bounce around to a few different power tools just to make sure that this piece comes out nice and square, because the squarer it is, the easier it's going to be to work with throughout the rest of the process here. And again, this is just a nice simple frame and panel design. We've got that main panel that we're going to allow for plenty of wood movement, and built into that frame, which is going to stay a nice stable size. This is one of my favorite ways to make tabletops because it does allow for a lot of that movement while still keeping that nice consistent size. And I really like using this method for making tabletops just because it's a little bit different than just using either a flat piece of wood or even a breadboard end tabletop. Just again, it's slightly different, and it all just comes down to what I think is going to look best for a piece. If I want to have something that's a little bit different looking, then I'll go this route. If I want something that's a little bit more traditional, I'll go with like a breadboard end top. Then, like I mentioned earlier, we're staining this thing a nice dark chocolate brown color. Now, initially my plan was to build this whole thing out of walnut because I really wanted to work with a natural wood, but when I went to the lumber yard, they were completely out of walnut and they told me they weren't going to be able to get any in for quite a while. So I went with my backup plan of taking this red oak, staining it this nice dark brown that I've used a lot in the past, and I'm actually very happy with the way that it looks, and it works even better with kind of the mishaps we faced during the stained glass, which you'll see in a little bit here. But overall, again, the color is just really nice, and I like the way that this piece came out. This final coloring was just really nice to look at. Now for the final part of this project, making the stained glass windows. Now this is one of the things that I've become obsessed with. Again, I've only done this on a couple projects so far, but I absolutely love working with this stained glass. Mostly because it drives me absolutely crazy, because there's a lot of little stuff that takes a lot of patience, there's a lot of little tedious parts of making the stained glass, and I can't explain why I enjoy it, because it is, again, it's quite annoying, it's quite tedious, and there's you'll see at the end of the video here how much trouble I had to go through to make this stuff look good, but it's one of those things where I just think it adds just a lot more visual interest to a piece, and all that effort that goes into making these windows just feels so worthwhile at the end of the project. Now, one of the questions I got asked a lot on the previous one is how expensive is this glasswork? And one of the things that kind of took me a while to get over with both this project and kind of the idea of getting into this in general is that the glass is probably the most expensive part of the whole project. Now, it's actual cost-wise, the glass and the zinc and all that together, into this project I would say I have about $250. Which is a decent amount when you consider that that's almost the same amount that I spent on the red oak for the structure of this piece. So that's one of the things that I think is very important to understand. When you see this glasswork, it's actually very expensive to make these windows, and this is something that I never really thought of. I thought it was, not cheap, but I didn't think it could be anywhere near that expensive. So it's one of those things. I have a greater appreciation for, stained glass work that I see now that I kind of know the price and just the overall effort that has to go into making it look even half decent. So I don't say all that to scare you away from doing the stained glass work. In fact, I highly recommend trying it out. If it's something that you're interested in, try it out, because it is something, in my opinion anyway, it changes the look of a piece entirely. Because what I like about the stained glass work is that it brings structure to an otherwise empty area. Now, this piece would look decently good if you just took some plain glass and put it in the empty spaces, but with that structure of the zinc frame around the stained glass, I just think that absolutely changes the entire look. And again, later on, you'll see in the finished piece, once we go through and have it in that finished stage, it just looks amazing. And interestingly enough, the way that I decided to finish this piece, the zinc is what ends up being the visually interesting part. The glass looks nice when you have some backlighting and light shining through the cabinet. It still looks good, but it's that raw zinc frame that actually ends up looking amazing. And that's one of the things that I've learned to really appreciate about this craft, is that it's not always about the glass itself. It's more about those shapes and that structure that you're building around the glass, and then you're using the glass to kind of accent that or to bring in certain details that you want. But the big thing is to really pay attention to the metalworking part and make sure that you've got those shapes in that are going to look appealing. And that's why on this one, I tried to use that diamond shape in the middle just to bring in some extra visual interest. Now, while that does make it look a little bit more interesting, it definitely made it much harder to assemble this window, because those 45 degrees tend to kind of push against each other and then force everything apart. So it took me a little while to figure out how to get things together, but once I got everything kind of tacked together nicely, I was able to get some good solder joints on here. And again, this is something that's taken me a lot of practice, and I wouldn't even say all of my solder joints on this project are absolutely perfect, but they're a heck of a lot better than they were on the previous project, and I think that's the most important part. Moving on to the cementing, this is again another good lesson learned from the previous one. I mixed in a lot more black milk paint to really give a nice dark black cement to the underside of all the zinc here. And then I really went to work polishing this thing up, and then we're moving on to the patina stage. So the patina is basically a mixture of chemicals that you apply to the zinc, and theoretically it's supposed to turn the zinc black. Now, when I did this, I got very, very angry afterwards, because basically what happens is that the zinc turned this beautiful, rich, dark black color, as you can see here, when I first applied the patina. But then as I did absolutely any work to it afterwards, that patina just rubs right off. And that's really not a nice thing, and it just kept getting worse and worse and worse, to the point where I decided to just polish up the zinc and go back to that raw silver color. So I'm using a mixture of 4-0 steel wool and Brasso to just really put a shine onto all of these pieces of zinc. And although it's not my typical style, I've never used silver hardware in any of my pieces of furniture, I actually really love the way that this looks. It looks very unique, very interesting, and it took a project that I was very disappointed in to one that I actually really like. I love the way this thing came out, and I'm going to enjoy it for many years to come. So as always, guys, I do hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you in the next one.